The crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling of the Aspen Country Club cast a warm, golden glow over the VIP banquet room, reflecting off the polished silverware and the rim of champagne flutes. The air smelled of roasted duck, expensive perfume, and the overwhelming stench of manufactured superiority. I sat near the back of the room, sipping ice water, watching the theatrical performance unfold at the head table. My father, Harrison, stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his glass. The soft chiming sound commanded immediate silence from the 50-something guests. Relatives, business associates, and sycophants who had spent decades feeding off his fabricated wealth all turned their attention to the patriarch. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo, a custom piece that easily cost more than the rent I paid for my first apartment. Beside him stood my twin sister, Fallon. She was wearing a silk designer dress, her hair perfectly styled, radiating the smug entitlement of a woman who had never worked a hard day in her 28 years of life. Tonight was our shared birthday, but in this family, it was solely Fallon's celebration. I was merely an obligation, a prop invited to sit in the corner and highlight the golden child's brilliance. Harrison cleared his throat, offering a practiced, magnanimous smile to his audience. He spoke about family values, about legacy, and about the incredible entrepreneurial spirit of his favorite daughter. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black leather box. He flipped it open to reveal a set of heavy, silver keys featuring a highly recognizable crest. "Here is your gift, Fallon. The keys to a brand new Porsche. You deserve it." His voice echoed loudly enough for every single person in the VIP room to hear. Fallon gasped, a performative display of shock, and threw her arms around his neck. The room erupted in thunderous applause. My mother, Corinne, dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, whispering about how proud she was. Aunts and uncles nodded in approval, raising their glasses to toast the brilliant young businesswoman who had never successfully launched a single company. Then, the applause died down. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It became electric, tense, and expectant. Every relative who had ignored my existence all night suddenly turned their heads my way. Their eyes were bright with anticipation. They were waiting for the punchline. They always waited for the punchline when it came to me. Harrison released Fallon and slowly turned his gaze toward my table at the back. The warm, fatherly smile evaporated, replaced by a theatrical, arrogant smirk that I knew all too well. He walked slowly toward my table, each step echoing on the hardwood floor. He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive suit jacket. For a split second, a naive, long-dead part of my inner child wondered if maybe, just this once, he would acknowledge me with a simple card. Instead, he pulled his hand out, holding his fingers in a tight pinch. He leaned over my table, looking down at me with absolute disdain. He opened his fingers and dropped a single, dirty penny onto the pristine white tablecloth. The dull, tarnished copper clinked against my crystal water glass, the sound sharp and offensive in the quiet room. "And this is what you deserve," he said, his voice dripping with mock pity and pure, unfiltered malice. "Try not to spend it all in one place, Sloane." The laughter started at his end of the table. It was low at first, then it spread like wildfire across the banquet hall. My Aunt Gemma slapped her hand heavily on the table, howling with cruel delight. My Uncle Marshall nearly choked on his vintage champagne, his face turning red from the effort of laughing so hard. Even my mother, Corinne, pressed her napkin to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles as she quickly looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. Fallon just stood near the podium, twirling her new Porsche keys around her perfectly manicured finger, giving me that familiar, condescending grin. They all thought this was the ultimate humiliation. They thought they had finally put the invisible, rebellious, worthless daughter back in her proper place. They expected me to break. They expected tears, a tantrum, or for me to grab my coat and run out into the Aspen blizzard, providing them with the dramatic exit they so desperately craved. I felt the heat rising in my chest, a phantom burning sensation that I had spent years learning to control. But I did not cry. I did not storm out. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I just sat perfectly still, staring at the filthy coin resting on the white linen. Then I felt a sharp, distinct vibration against my ribs. My phone was buzzing inside my tailored blazer pocket. The timing was so flawless, so incredibly perfect, it almost felt like a script written by a vengeful god. I slowly reached into my pocket, pulled out the phone, and tapped the screen. The harsh blue light illuminated my face. It was a short, simple, automated text message from a state notary named Warren. It read exactly the words I had been waiting for all night. The execution order was signed. The legal transfer was officially recorded. The grace period was over. I locked the screen, slid the phone back into my pocket, and looked right back into my father's arrogant, mocking eyes. The corners of my mouth curled upward into a cold, empty smile. "Perfect timing," I said. My voice was dead level, devoid of any anger or sorrow. It was the voice of a woman reading a death sentence. Harrison's smile vanished instantly. The theatrical arrogance melted off his face, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. He did not understand my reaction. They all thought I was just looking at a text from a friend, trying to distract myself from the embarrassment. They had absolutely no idea that I was reading a confirmation that the countdown to their total financial destruction had just hit 0. My mother, Corinne, noticed the shift in my posture. Her face went completely pale, the laughter dying in her throat. She gripped the edge of the table, whispering in absolute panic. "Do not do this. Please," she murmured, her eyes starting between me and Harrison. But it was too late. The trap had already snapped shut. The empire was already dead. If you love seeing toxic people get the brutal, inescapable instant karma they deserve, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, let me take you back and show you exactly how I legally dismantled my family's fake luxurious life, brick by brick, starting with that dirty penny. The tarnished coin sitting on the tablecloth was the perfect physical representation of how Harrison had operated this family for nearly 3 decades. He used money as a blunt weapon. To him, financial control was the only metric of power in this world, the only way to measure a person's worth. If you nodded at his lectures, stroked his fragile ego, and played the role of the adoring audience, you were rewarded with luxury vehicles, exotic vacations, and endless trust funds. But if you showed a single shred of independence, if you dared to step out of his carefully constructed shadow, you became a cautionary tale. He thrived on the audience. He needed them to laugh, and he needed me to fail, just to validate his own supremacy. What did I do next to shatter his illusion? Growing up in the ancestral estate felt like living inside a massive, beautifully decorated museum dedicated solely to my own insignificance. Every room, every hallway, every locked door held a specific memory of being pushed aside. The architecture of my childhood was built on the foundation of the golden child and the invisible child. Fallon was the golden child. She was the exact reflection Harrison wanted to see when he looked in the mirror. She was loud, fiercely demanding, deeply superficial, and utterly dependent on his wallet. That dependence made her the perfect daughter for a man who desperately needed to feel like an omnipotent king. I, on the other hand, was the invisible child. I was quiet, logical, observant, and deeply skeptical of the performances happening around me. Those traits made me an uncontrollable threat to his narrative. The financial disparity was not just a subtle undertone, it was a bludgeon they used daily. I vividly remember a specific winter when Fallon and I were 17 years old. Fallon had spent weeks begging for a luxury ski trip to the Swiss Alps with her prep school friends. Harrison did not just agree to the trip, he handed her his premium black credit card with absolutely no spending limit, telling her to represent the family well. That exact same week, the internal heating unit in my bedroom, located in the drafty northern wing of the house, broke down completely. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing. When I went to Harrison's home office and quietly asked him to call a repairman, he did not even look up from his mahogany desk. He told me to put on a thick sweater and stop being a constant financial burden. I spent that entire winter sleeping in 2 heavy winter coats, shivering under thin blankets, while Fallon posted daily pictures on social media of herself drinking artisan hot cocoa in a private, heated chalet overlooking the mountains. But the memory that truly cemented my place in the family hierarchy, the moment the final door closed in my heart, happened a year later. I was 18, desperately trying to secure a future that did not involve bowing to Harrison. I had taken a job working night shifts as a janitor at a local commercial office building to save up money for college application fees and a deposit on a cheap apartment. I scrubbed linoleum floors. I emptied foul-smelling trash cans. I wiped down bathroom mirrors until 2 in the morning, my hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh industrial chemicals. After 3 months of grueling, humiliating labor, I managed to save exactly $500. I kept that money in a plain white envelope, hidden securely inside a hollowed-out, discarded history textbook in the back of my closet. It was my escape fund. It was my freedom. One Wednesday afternoon, I came home from high school to find my bedroom door wide open and my closet ransacked. Clothes were thrown on the floor. The history book was lying open on the rug. The white envelope was gone. Panic seized my chest. I ran downstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs, and found Fallon in the grand living room. She was twirling around, showing off a brand new, limited edition designer handbag to our mother. The price tag, still dangling from the gold handle, was exactly $500. When I confronted her, my voice shaking with rage and devastation, Fallon did not even try to deny it. She just rolled her eyes, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and said she needed it for a high-profile party that weekend. She claimed it was a social emergency and that I was hoarding cash for no good reason. I turned to my mother, Corinne, tears of pure frustration stinging my eyes, expecting at least a sliver of maternal justice. Instead, Corinne let out a long, dramatic sigh, looking at me as if my anger was a massive inconvenience to her peaceful afternoon. "Your sister needs to maintain her image in her social circle, Sloane," Corinne said, casually sipping her diet soda. "You just wear thrift store clothes and baggy jeans anyway. What do you even need that kind of cash for? Stop being so incredibly selfish." Selfish. That was the word they used to describe my desire for basic, fundamental respect. My labor, my sweat, my future was entirely expendable if it meant funding Fallon's superficial desires. I left that house 3 days later. I packed a single canvas duffel bag, took whatever meager cash was left from my next janitorial paycheck, and walked out the front door without looking back. I refused to let my entire existence be dictated by Harrison's conditional, toxic checkbook. While Fallon was attending elite networking galas on his dime, pretending to be a visionary entrepreneur and floating from one hollow startup to another, I was waiting tables at a diner to pay for my finance degree. I took the grueling extra shifts. I slept on a mattress on the floor in cheap, unheated apartments. I survived on instant noodles and sheer, unadulterated willpower. Most importantly, I completely cut myself off from his financial leverage. I stopped calling. I stopped asking for help. This infuriated Harrison to no end. Since he could no longer control me with the threat of cutting off my funds, he tried to control me through public humiliation at every mandatory family gathering I occasionally attended. What Harrison, Corinne, Fallon, and the rest of the laughing relatives in that Aspen VIP room did not know was what I had actually built during those 10 years of absolute silence. They still pictured me as the struggling, pathetic girl scrubbing floors and begging for scraps. They had absolutely no idea that I now lived on the East Coast, working as a senior portfolio liquidator for a major, ruthless private equity fund. My daily routine involved analyzing corporate risk, aggressively restructuring assets, and legally liquidating the massive portfolios of bankrupt, arrogant individuals who lived far beyond their means. I managed hundreds of millions of dollars. I understood the unforgiving mechanics of debt leverage, asset seizure, and foreclosure better than any financial advisor sitting at that banquet table. I learned very early on that blood makes you related, but money makes them respect you. I just never expected that my brutal, specialized career path would one day put my own father's private financial files directly onto my polished desk. How did the untouchable patriarch fall so far into the red? The truth about Harrison's heavily guarded empire began to rapidly unravel exactly 3 months before the infamous birthday party in Aspen. It did not start with a dramatic revelation, but rather with an incredibly annoying, demanding phone call from Uncle Marshall. I was sitting in my corner office on the 24th floor, reviewing a complex corporate liquidation strategy for a failing tech firm, when my personal cell phone began to ring. I rarely got calls from the family unless they needed a punching bag or a scapegoat to blame for their own mistakes. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice entirely neutral and professional. Marshall did not even bother with his standard greeting. He immediately launched into a frantic, aggressive, and highly demanding rant. He insisted that I immediately sign paperwork to act as a financial guarantor for a massive commercial lease for Fallon. Your sister is opening her 4th luxury aesthetic clinic downtown. Marshall barked over the line, the sound of ice clinking in a glass echoing in the background. She needs a guarantor with a clean credit history. Your father's capital is tied up right now with some massive overseas investments, so you need to step up and do your part for this family for once in your life. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen with a mixture of disgust and dark amusement. Fallon was an absolute fraud. She played the part of the visionary business owner beautifully on Instagram, constantly posting pictures of herself in tailored suits cutting ribbons. She launched tech apps that never went to market and opened boutique luxury spas that consistently filed for bankruptcy within 8 months. She was a massive financial black hole, and Harrison was the proud, desperate sponsor of her relentless incompetence. I put the phone back to my ear and told Marshall that I would rather set my own money on fire than co-sign a single piece of paper for Fallon. Marshall immediately exploded. He cursed at me, calling me an ungrateful, spiteful failure, and aggressively slammed the phone down. I tossed my phone onto my desk, intending to ignore the interaction entirely. But his specific words bothered my analytical brain. Harrison's capital is tied up. That statement did not make any logical sense. Harrison always bragged relentlessly about his endless liquid cash flow. He made sure everyone in the country club knew he could buy and sell them 10 times over without breaking a sweat. Real titans of industry do not ask their estranged daughters to co-sign a lease. Out of pure professional curiosity, and perhaps a small dose of suspicion, I booted up my secure terminal. I had the specialized tools, the encrypted software, and the legal clearance to check public real estate filings, tax liens, and deep credit registries that most normal people did not even know existed. I typed in the exact address of the family's massive ancestral mansion, fully expecting to see a clear, untouchable title deed. What I saw flashing across my dual monitors made my blood run completely cold. The massive estate was not just mortgaged. It was suffocating under an absolute mountain of toxic, predatory debt. Harrison had taken out a massive home equity line of credit. Then, when that dried up, he took out another. And another. Over the last 7 years, he had aggressively cross-collateralized the property 5 separate times. I stared at the final tally at the bottom of the screen. The total outstanding debt was sitting at $2,400,000. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the shock on my face. The numbers absolutely did not lie. Harrison was not a wealthy, untouchable titan of real estate. He was a desperate, drowning man frantically juggling flaming torches while standing in a pool of gasoline. He was burning through incredibly high-interest borrowed cash just to maintain the fragile illusion of his success. He was aggressively funding Fallon's fake businesses, paying for exorbitant country club memberships, and leasing luxury vehicles using money that completely belonged to the bank. He was entirely, unequivocally broke. His net worth was a massive negative number. I quickly scrolled through the complex amortization schedules. The loans were bleeding his accounts dry at an astonishing rate. The primary lender was already flagging his file, preparing to classify the massive debt as a non-performing asset. This meant the bank was getting ready to sell the toxic debt to a specialized collection agency or private equity firm at a massive discount, just to scrub the liability off their quarterly books. I was fully prepared to close the file, log out of the system, and walk away. I was ready to let the brutal reality of the financial market tear them apart organically. Let the banks throw them out on the street. It was not my problem anymore. But then, my eyes caught something else. I dug a little deeper into the ledger, looking at the exact transaction dates when the largest, most aggressive withdrawals were made from the equity lines. The bulk of that borrowed money, nearly $1 million, had been forcefully pulled out exactly 7 years ago. 7 years ago. My breath caught in my throat. My hands stopped moving over the keyboard. 7 years ago was the exact time my older brother, Beckett, tragically passed away. I felt a sudden, sharp, suffocating pain in the center of my chest. I looked at the massive cash withdrawals, the timeline, the desperate financial maneuvering, and suddenly, my perspective shifted entirely. This was not just a case of a foolish man going bankrupt to buy nice cars. This was something darker. This wasn't just business anymore. It was blood. What really happened to my brother? Beckett was the only real family I ever had in that massive, hollow house. He was 4 years older than me, possessing a brilliant, quiet, and gentle soul who wanted absolutely nothing more than to design buildings and sketch architectural blueprints. He was the only person in that intensely toxic environment who ever looked at me and told me I was actually worth something. When I was sobbing on the back porch over the $500 Fallon had stolen, Beckett was the one who sat beside me in the dark, wrapped his jacket around my shivering shoulders, and promised that one day we would both escape this madness. But he never made it out. 7 years ago, at the incredibly young age of 20, Beckett took his own life. The official family narrative, fiercely and aggressively protected by Harrison and Corinne, was that Beckett had succumbed to a sudden, entirely inexplicable bout of severe depression. They played the role of the tragic, grieving parents flawlessly. They soaked up the endless sympathy of the country club elite, turning his heartbreaking death into a dramatic tragedy that happened to them, rather than something they actively caused. I always knew in my gut there was more to the story. I knew Beckett was strong, but I never had the physical proof to challenge Harrison's ironclad narrative. Until I found the financial timeline and reached out to Graham. Graham had been Beckett's absolute best friend since middle school. He was a quiet, meticulous auditor who lived a few hours away in Denver. When I saw the incredibly suspicious dates on Harrison's massive loan withdrawals aligning perfectly with the timeline of Beckett's death, my gut instinct screamed at me to contact him. We arranged to meet at a dimly lit, completely empty coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. A heavy rain was lashing against the large glass windows, blurring the streetlights outside. Graham looked exhausted. He had deep circles under his eyes, carrying the weight of a secret he was never meant to keep. He did not say much at first. He simply unzipped his leather messenger bag and slid a worn, intricately carved wooden box across the sticky table. "I have kept this hidden in a safe for 7 years, Sloane," Graham said, his voice trembling, barely above a hoarse whisper. "I was waiting for someone in the family who was not completely blinded by your father's lies. Beckett wanted you to know the truth, but he was too ashamed at the time to face you." My hands shook as I reached for the brass latch. I opened the box. Inside was a thick, meticulously organized stack of printed email threads and handwritten notes. I picked up the first piece of paper, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There was no sudden, inexplicable depression. There was only the systematic, ruthless destruction of a young man's spirit. The documents clearly proved that Beckett had earned a full academic scholarship to an incredibly prestigious architecture program on the West Coast. But, to secure his enrollment, he desperately needed a minor stipend for housing and initial university supplies. He had worked tirelessly, saving up the necessary funds himself, but he kept the money in an old joint account that Harrison still had legal control over from when Beckett was a minor. Harrison drained it. He aggressively seized every single cent of Beckett's hard-earned savings and immediately funneled it into Fallon's very first, incredibly poorly planned startup venture. A venture that predictably crashed and burned into absolute bankruptcy in less than 3 months. When Beckett found out his account was empty and frantically confronted his father, practically begging for the funds to secure his entire future, Harrison did not apologize. He did not offer a loan. He viciously attacked. I read the printed email Harrison sent to his own son. The words were so cruel, so utterly devoid of humanity, they burned themselves permanently into my retinas. "You are a weak-willed, pathetic burden," Harrison had typed, the black ink glaring off the white page. "You live in a fantasy world. You will never amount to anything in the real world of business. I am absolutely not wasting my hard-earned resources on a guaranteed failure. Your sister has a brilliant future. You are just a disappointment. Do everyone a favor and stop whining about money you do not deserve." Harrison had systematically stripped Beckett of his dignity, his life savings, and his only viable escape route. He destroyed a brilliant, hopeful young man just to feed the endless, gaping ego of the golden child. The massive $2 million loans Harrison took out 7 years ago were a desperate attempt to cover up the massive financial crater Fallon had created immediately after stealing and burning through Beckett's money. I sat in the cold coffee shop, staring at the harsh black text until my vision blurred. I did not cry. Crying was for people who felt helpless. I felt something entirely different. The cold, highly analytical part of my brain perfectly merged with a deep, violent, and unquenchable need for absolute justice. The man who would eventually throw a dirty penny at me in Aspen was the exact same monster who forcefully pushed his own son into the dark abyss. The endless cycle of debt and gross incompetence in that family was built entirely upon the ruined foundation of my brother's life. My mission was no longer merely to watch them fail from a distance. The cold, surgical financial victory I originally envisioned was no longer enough. I was now an agent of an overdue, catastrophic accounting. How exactly was I going to make them pay? I returned to my corporate office on the East Coast the following Monday with a singular, terrifying focus. The initial shock and paralyzing grief had burned away completely, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp determination. I did not bother stopping at my desk. I walked straight down the glass hallway and directly into the expansive corner office of my direct supervisor, Delaney. Delaney was an incredibly formidable woman. She was ruthless, brilliant, and possessed absolutely zero tolerance for corporate nonsense or emotional instability. She knew my background implicitly, and she knew I never, under any circumstances, let personal emotions interfere with my aggressive liquidation strategies. I firmly placed Harrison's massive, heavily flagged financial file on her pristine glass desk, right next to the worn wooden box containing Beckett's devastating letters. "I need immediate executive clearance to personally purchase a highly distressed asset," I told her, my voice eerily steady and devoid of any inflection. "It is a direct conflict of interest, so I am officially disclosing it to the firm right now. I want to buy my father's defaulted mortgages." Delaney did not immediately speak. She opened the thick folder. Her sharp eyes rapidly scanned the massive debt figures, the reckless cross-collateralization, and the severe default warnings issued by the primary lenders. Then, she slowly reached over and glanced at the top email in the wooden box. She read Harrison's cruel words to Beckett. She did not ask for a long, weeping, emotional explanation. She saw the objective numbers, and she saw the undeniable cruelty. She closed the folder with a sharp snap, looking up at me with a gaze that could cut through steel. "Crush them entirely," she said simply, her tone icy. "But you absolutely do not use company funds for this vendetta, Sloan. You do this entirely on your own paper. Keep the firm completely out of the legal blast radius." I nodded once. I did not need the firm's capital. I had spent the last 10 years of my life living far below my means, investing aggressively in high-yield markets, and building my own impenetrable financial fortress. I went back to my desk and immediately began liquidating my personal stock portfolios. I cleared out my high-yield savings accounts. Within 48 hours, I had gathered exactly $850,000 in pure, highly liquid cash. I quietly established an anonymous shell corporation, a limited liability company registered in Delaware, purposefully named Vanguard Recovery. Through this heavily shielded entity, I aggressively approached the primary lender holding Harrison's incredibly toxic notes. Because I understood the complex valuation of distressed paper significantly better than the casual, amateur investors who usually chase these banking auctions, my shell company negotiated and secured the entire debt at a massive, unprecedented discount. The bank executives were absolutely thrilled to offload the garbage off their balance sheets. They quickly executed a formal assignment of mortgage. This single, heavily stamped document was the legal cornerstone of my maneuver. It formally and irrevocably transferred all the rights of the mortgagee from the major bank directly to Vanguard Recovery. In the blind eyes of the law, I was no longer just the invisible, worthless daughter they could openly mock at dinner parties. I was now the secured creditor. I held the absolute legal power to strictly enforce the terms of his defaulted loan. I effectively held the deed to the massive ancestral mansion. I held the supreme leverage over the luxury cars, the frozen accounts, and every single material thing they desperately used to pretend they were untouchable royalty. Harrison operated under the incredibly arrogant assumption that his mounting debt was a strictly private matter between him and a faceless, forgiving bank. He did not realize the entity now holding his promissory note was a hostile organization under my total, unyielding control. I spent weeks meticulously reviewing the complex amortization schedules. I mapped out the exact grace periods, the late penalties, and the most aggressive legal remedies available to me under the strict state property code. I quietly prepared the eviction notices. I paid a highly aggressive state notary, Warren, to have the massive stack of foreclosure documents officially stamped, sealed by a judge, and ready for immediate execution. Everything was perfectly lined up for a cold, surgical, and utterly devastating financial victory. I was standing at the edge of the cliff, entirely ready to pull the trigger and watch their empire burn to the ground. But then, they made one final, fatal mistake that sealed their fate. What did they try to do to me? Just when I thought my meticulously crafted plan was perfectly concealed and ready to deploy, the desperate rats in my family decided to make a preemptive strike. 2 weeks before Fallon's massive birthday celebration in Aspen, they made a highly calculated move that instantly erased any lingering, microscopic shred of mercy I might have unknowingly harbored. Fallon had apparently run into an old college acquaintance of mine who worked in a competing financial sector. This acquaintance casually mentioned over drinks that I was doing exceptionally well as a senior portfolio director, handling massive accounts. The very idea that I possessed actual, tangible wealth and professional respect was entirely unacceptable to them. If I truly had money and status, it meant Harrison's lifelong narrative about me being an utter failure was completely wrong. Even worse in their eyes, if I had money, I could potentially be used and manipulated. Harrison and Fallon immediately hatched a vicious, highly illegal scheme. They figured if they could rapidly destabilize my lucrative career and force me into sudden financial ruin, I would have absolutely no choice but to come crawling back home, defeated and broken, where they could easily control me and force me to take out massive personal loans to fund Fallon's failing clinics. They anonymously called the Federal Compliance and Ethics Hotline at my private equity firm. Fallon purposely disguised her voice, attempting to sound like a concerned whistleblower, and fed the board of directors a completely fabricated, highly damaging story. She aggressively claimed she had undeniable insider knowledge that I was actively embezzling millions in client funds and engaging in complex, illegal wire fraud. It was a vicious, highly calculated attempt to instantly trigger a massive federal investigation, freeze my accounts, and permanently destroy my professional license. But they severely underestimated the intense, highly monitored world I worked in. And they catastrophically underestimated Delaney. All compliance hotline calls at the firm were automatically recorded and traced. Delaney, being the head of the division, pulled the audio file immediately. She possessed an incredibly sharp ear for deception. She instantly recognized the forced, arrogant cadence of Fallon's voice and, more importantly, she heard the distinct background noise of Harrison heavily clearing his throat and whispering instructions off microphone. Delaney called me into her pristine office, locked the door, and played the audio recording out loud on her speaker system. I stood there, frozen in place, listening to the voices of my own twin sister and my biological father actively trying to ruin my entire life, just out of pure spite, jealousy, and greed. They were fully willing to send me to federal prison, to see me locked in a cage, just to fiercely protect their own fragile egos and secure a new funding source. Delaney paused the audio, the silence in the room deafening. "Well," she said, leaning back in her heavy leather chair, steepling her fingers. "It seems your family is not just casually toxic. They are actively, criminally malicious. What exactly do you want to do about this, Sloane? I can involve the corporate legal department right now and sue them into oblivion for severe defamation and tortious interference." "No," I said, staring blankly at the dark speaker on her desk, my voice devoid of any human warmth. "A corporate lawsuit takes years of tedious mediation. I prefer something much more instantaneous. They tried to destroy my career over a petty, desperate grudge. By doing so, they enthusiastically handed me the final, heavy iron nail for their own coffin. The blatant sabotage attempt absolutely confirmed that they were completely beyond any form of redemption. They were parasites. And parasites do not respond to logic, love, or mercy. They only respond to overwhelming, inescapable force." I finalized the massive stack of foreclosure paperwork that very afternoon. I booked my first-class flight to Aspen for the grand birthday celebration. I carefully packed the thick, heavy binder of red-stamped legal documents, the intricately carved wooden box containing Beckett's final letters, and a sleek, intimidating black blazer. Everything was perfectly, flawlessly aligned. They were going to throw a massive, expensive party to aggressively celebrate their fabricated wealth and superiority, and I was going to attend as the absolute grim reaper of their finances. The countdown was aggressively ticking. The trap was set. Thank you for watching this far. Please comment "I'm Win" below. It's a special sign for viewers who have watched this far, and I will like and reply to all comments containing the keyword "I'm Win." Don't miss the next part. The heavy, suffocating silence in the VIP banquet room felt like a physical weight pressing down on every single person present. Just seconds ago, these wealthy elites were howling with laughter at the dirty penny resting on my table. They were reveling in my humiliation, entirely content to watch the outcast daughter be put back in her place. Now, their laughter had evaporated into the thick, tense air of the Aspen Country Club. They watched me stand up from my chair. I did not rush. I moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of someone who had already won the war before the first shot was ever fired. I reached down, picked up the filthy copper coin, rubbed it smoothly between my thumb and index finger, and slipped it safely into my blazer pocket. I wanted to keep it. I wanted a physical reminder of the exact moment they sealed their own fate. Then I began to walk toward the front of the room. The crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to dim slightly as I approached the center stage. My father, Harrison, stood frozen near the podium. His theatrical, arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of deep, unsettling confusion. He did not understand what was happening. In his mind, I was supposed to be crying. I was supposed to be running out the door. My calm demeanor was breaking his carefully written script. Fallon had stopped twirling her shiny new Porsche keys. She stared at me, her brow furrowed in severe irritation, furious that I was daring to steal the spotlight on her designated night of triumph. My mother, Corinne, remained seated. Her knuckles were turning stark white as she gripped the edges of the linen tablecloth, a profound sense of impending doom washing over her perfectly made-up features. She had always been a coward, and right now, her survival instincts were screaming at her that something was terribly wrong. I reached the podium and gently pulled the microphone from its silver stand. A brief, sharp whine of audio feedback echoed through the hall, causing several aunts and uncles in the front row to visibly flinch and cover their ears. I looked out over the crowd of 50 guests. I saw the faces of every single relative, business partner, and sycophant who had spent the last 2 decades enabling my family's toxic behavior. I saw the people who had eaten our food, drank our wine, and politely ignored the emotional abuse happening right in front of them. We gather here tonight to celebrate the immense success of the patriarch. I began, my voice steady, echoing clearly across the expansive room. I maintained perfect, unwavering eye contact with Harrison. We celebrate a man who claims to have built an empire. A man who uses his immense wealth to bestow luxury vehicles upon his favored daughter and generously hands out pennies to remind the rest of us of our precise place in his grand, untouchable kingdom. Truly, it is a magnificent display of financial supremacy. Low murmurs rippled through the crowd. They were profoundly confused. Was I surrendering? Was I finally bowing to his authority? Harrison's rigid posture relaxed a fraction of an inch. A tiny, condescending smile began to creep back onto his face. He actually thought I was finally breaking under the pressure, giving him the public submission he so desperately craved to feed his ego. But then Uncle Marshall aggressively stood up from his chair in the second row. His face was flushed red from the vintage champagne and his own inflated sense of self-importance. Marshall had always been Harrison's most loyal lapdog, eager to do the patriarch's bidding in exchange for a few financial crumbs. "What in the world are you doing, Sloane?" Marshall barked, waving his hand dismissively in the air. "Get down from there right now. You are making a fool of yourself and ruining your sister's birthday. You have no right to speak about his wealth when you bring nothing to the table. Sit down and show some respect." I slowly turned my gaze away from Harrison and locked eyes with Marshall. The room grew so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the crystal water glasses. "Respect, Marshall?" I asked softly, stepping slightly closer to the edge of the stage. That is an interesting word coming from a man who is currently drowning in undisclosed, predatory debt. "Tell me, does your wife, Gemma, know about the secret personal loans?" Marshall's face went entirely pale. The aggressive red flush vanished, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Does Aunt Gemma know that you quietly borrowed $120,000 from Harrison just 4 months ago to cover your failing real estate investments on the East Side?" I continued, projecting my voice so every single syllable landed like a heavy hammer blow. "Does she know you missed the last 3 payments and that you are standing here tonight desperately kissing up to him just so he does not call in the note and take your house?" A sharp, collective gasp echoed through the banquet room. Aunt Gemma whipped her head around to stare at her husband. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. Marshall began to stammer, his hands trembling violently as he reached out to touch her shoulder. "Gemma, wait, I can explain," Marshall choked out. But Gemma forcefully swatted his arm away, her face twisting in a vicious mix of betrayal and rage. She realized in an instant that her comfortable, wealthy lifestyle was a complete illusion. The illusion of polite, wealthy society fractured instantly. The elegant facade was cracking, piece by piece. Harrison stepped forward, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The patriarch could not handle losing control of his audience. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "That is enough," Harrison shouted, abandoning his refined, upper-class persona entirely. "I will not have a spiteful, jealous failure stand at my prestigious event and spout baseless, insane lies. Security. I want her removed from these premises right now." He gestured wildly toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall, frantically scanning the room for the country club staff. He was losing his grip, reverting to brute force when his standard intimidation tactics failed to work. The sophisticated patriarch had vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal thrashing blindly in a trap. He thought he could just throw me out and return to his expensive champagne. He thought the performance was over. But I did not move an inch. I simply looked past him, staring directly toward the heavy double doors at the entrance of the banquet hall. "Oh, you do not need to call security, Harrison," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his frantic shouting. "I already invited someone to the party. And he is right on time." Right on cue, the massive oak doors swung open. The heavy oak doors of the VIP room pushed open with a loud, resounding thud that echoed sharply over the anxious murmurs of the crowd. Every single head in the banquet hall, including Harrison's, snapped toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked profoundly out of place in the sea of tuxedos, silk ties, and designer gowns. It was Warren. He wore a simple, dark gray suit, a thick wool overcoat, and his broad shoulders were dusted with a thin layer of fresh snow from the brutal aspen blizzard raging outside. He was a state license process server and senior notary, a man whose entire career revolved around delivering the harsh, unforgiving realities of the legal system to people who thought their money made them untouchable. Tucked securely under his left arm was a massive, thick binder filled with heavy legal paper. Warren did not wait for a polite invitation. He walked straight down the center aisle of the banquet room, his heavy winter boots thudding rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The wealthy guests instinctively pulled their chairs back, parting like the Red Sea to let him through. He carried an aura of undeniable authority, a grim reaper dressed in gray. Harrison stared at the approaching stranger, his chest heaving with exertion and panic. "Who the hell are you?" Harrison demanded, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. "This is a private event. You are trespassing. Get out before I have you arrested." Warren stopped right in front of the head table. He did not flinch. He did not show a single ounce of intimidation. He calmly opened the thick binder and pulled out a massive stack of documents stamped heavily in bright red ink. He placed them firmly onto the glass table, right next to the empty velvet Porsche box. "Harrison," Warren said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of emotion. "You are officially served. These are the finalized, court-ordered execution documents regarding the multiple defaulted home equity lines of credit attached to your primary residential estate." Harrison staggered back a half step as if he had been physically struck in the jaw. His eyes darted to the bright red stamps, instantly recognizing the severe, unforgiving format of banking foreclosure notices. He leaned in, his bravado fracturing into a million pieces as he tried to comprehend how these intensely private, catastrophic financial records had ended up on display at his public celebration. "This is a mistake," Harrison stammered, his hands hovering over the papers but refusing to touch them, as if they were burning hot. "This is a banking error. A massive clerical misunderstanding. My holding company is currently restructuring our assets. You have no right to bring this here." Warren pulled a silver pen from his pocket and tapped the top sheet of paper firmly. "This is not a mistake. The grace periods expired 3 weeks ago. The state-mandated redemption windows are permanently closed. The lender sold the toxic debt. You no longer own the estate. You no longer possess any equity. Your assets are seized by the secured creditor." Harrison frantically looked at the creditor name listed on the primary transfer deed. It read Vanguard Recovery LLC. He looked around the room, desperate for a lifeline, desperate for someone to blame for this nightmare. "Who is Vanguard Recovery?" Harrison yelled, spittle flying from his lips. "What kind of predatory garbage is this? Who authorized this buyout?" I stepped down from the podium and walked slowly toward the table. I reached out and firmly placed my hand flat on top of the red stamped documents. "I am Vanguard Recovery," I stated. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The relatives who had been loudly whispering just moments ago fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Corinne let out a soft, horrified whimper, burying her face in her trembling hands, her diamond rings catching the light as she wept. "I personally executed the buyout of your distressed notes when your primary lender decided you were no longer worth the financial risk," I continued, locking my eyes onto Harrison's pale, sweating face. "I used my own capital to purchase the debt. Which means, Harrison, I am now your secured creditor. I legally own the ancestral house. I own the land. I own the remaining equity. And I own the exclusive legal right to evict you." Fallon, who had been standing frozen in the background, suddenly marched forward. Her face was contorted in furious, ugly disbelief. She waved the silver keys aggressively in the air. "You're lying," Fallon screeched, her voice shrill and grating, echoing painfully in the quiet room. "You're just a jealous loser. Dad just bought me a brand new Porsche in cash. Broke people do not buy luxury sports cars." I turned my attention to my twin sister. I felt a surge of cold pity for how incredibly ignorant she was. I slowly pulled a secondary document from Warren's binder and slid it across the glass table toward her. "He did not buy that car with cash, Fallon," I said. "He leased it using a fraudulent draw from a home equity line on a house he no longer owns. That vehicle was secured with toxic debt. It is essentially stolen property from the bank. And because the primary asset has been foreclosed, the auto lender has already issued an immediate repossession order. The tow trucks are already outside in the valet lot." Fallon stared blankly at the paper. The smug, entitled grin that had been plastered across her face for 28 years vanished into thin air. She looked down at her hands. The heavy, metallic Porsche keys suddenly seemed to burn her skin. They slipped through her trembling fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. The sharp noise of the keys hitting the ground echoed in the quiet hall. She made no effort to pick them up. The devastating realization hit her in real time. Her entire identity, built on a fragile foundation of parental funding and fake startups, collapsed the exact moment those keys hit the ground. She was not a business prodigy. She was the financial ruin of her own family. Harrison opened his mouth to issue another desperate denial, to spin a wild narrative about temporary liquidity problems, but the physical evidence was far too overwhelming. The county seals reflected the harsh lighting of the chandelier, offering zero room for manipulation. But I was not finished. The financial ruin was merely the instrument of my execution. I needed everyone in that room to understand the exact reason why I had systematically engineered his downfall. Harrison was frantically looking around the room, trying to make eye contact with his wealthy friends and business partners. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, sweating profusely, stammering about temporary cash flow issues and short-term restructuring. He was desperately trying to mask the undeniable fact that he was profoundly broke and publicly exposed. "Please, everyone, do not listen to her," Harrison pleaded, his voice thin, reedy, and pathetic. "This is just a complex tax strategy. A temporary hurdle. We are perfectly fine. The market fluctuates, you all know how it is." I watched him scramble to salvage his fragile pride for a few seconds before I reached into my leather bag. The financial ruin I had just laid out on the table was a surgical strike, a necessary mechanism, but it was not my underlying motive. Taking his money was just the prologue. I pulled out the beautifully carved wooden box that Graham had given me. The room watched in absolute, terrifying silence as I unlatched the brass hook and slowly opened the lid. I did not pull out bank statements or court seals. I pulled out a stack of old, slightly yellowed printed emails and handwritten letters. They bore the timestamps of 7 years ago. "This is not about a defaulted loan," I stated, my voice projecting across the silent, breathless hall. "The paperwork on that table is just the mechanism. The real debt you owe cannot be paid with money." I turned my attention away from Harrison and addressed the crowd directly. I noticed my younger cousin, sitting 3 tables away, had her phone propped up against a wine glass. The red recording light was on. She was actively live streaming the entire confrontation to her massive following on social media. I did not stop her. I wanted her to record it. The world needed to see this. The carefully curated lie was about to be burned to ashes. "These are the final emails and letters written by my brother, Beckett," I said, holding the papers up for the room to see. "For 7 years, this family has maintained the comfortable, polite lie that his passing was a tragic, unavoidable consequence of sudden, severe depression. You all accepted that story because it was easy. It absolved everyone of responsibility. It allowed you to keep drinking Harrison's wine and attending his parties without feeling guilty." I looked back at Harrison. The panic in his eyes was no longer about losing his house or his luxury cars. It was about losing his mask. The deep, dark, putrid secret he had buried 7 years ago was standing right in front of him, illuminated by the chandeliers. Beckett did not just give up. I continued, my voice trembling ever so slightly with righteous, long overdue fury. He was systematically, intentionally pushed into the dark. When he earned his academic scholarship to study architecture, he needed a minor stipend to secure his enrollment. Instead of supporting his own son, Harrison emptied Beckett's dedicated savings fund to finance one of Fallon's catastrophic, failed business ventures. Fallon gasped, taking a step back, her hands flying to her mouth as if she had been slapped. And when Beckett begged for his own money back, Harrison responded with this. I looked down at the harsh black text and read Harrison's exact words aloud. I cited the brutal sentences where he called his own son a weak-willed burden. I read the agonizing lines where he explicitly stated that Beckett lived in a fantasy world, would never succeed, and was not worth a single cent of family investment. The sheer cruelty of the text echoed off the walls of the luxurious VIP room, cutting through the silence like a jagged, rusted knife. You drove a 20-year-old boy to his breaking point just to protect your ego and fund your golden child. I told Harrison, dropping the emails onto the glass table right next to the red-stamped foreclosure notice. You stole his future. So I bought yours. The loss of your home, your assets, and your public standing today is the exact price of what you did to him. The reaction from the guests was immediate, visceral, and devastating. The initial shock of the financial revelation rapidly morphed into pure, unadulterated horror. Relatives physically recoiled from the head table. An aunt in the front row covered her mouth with both hands, staring at Harrison with raw, unfiltered disgust. Even the sycophants who had cheered for him 10 minutes ago were now looking at him like he was a diseased monster. No one offered a single word of defense. No one suggested a misunderstanding. The evidence was right there in his own written words, broadcasted live to the internet. Then, the final domino fell. Reed, Fallon's handsome, incredibly wealthy fiancé, had been standing quietly near the back of the stage. He was a pragmatist, a man who cared deeply about social standing and financial security. He had attached himself to Fallon under the strict assumption that she was the heir to a massive real estate empire and a brilliant entrepreneur. Reed listened to the emails. He looked at the foreclosure documents. He looked at Fallon, who was now weeping hysterically on the floor next to the dropped car keys, her mascara running down her cheeks. Reed's face hardened into a mask of cold, ruthless calculation. He realized in an instant that this family was not just entirely broke, they were severely toxic, publicly disgraced, and legally radioactive. Without saying a single word, Reed reached into his tailored pocket. He pulled out the velvet box containing the massive diamond engagement ring he had given Fallon 3 months ago. He walked over to the table, placed the velvet box next to the red-stamped documents, turned on his heel, and walked straight out the heavy oak doors without looking back. Fallon let out a blood-curdling scream, scrambling across the hardwood floor to grab the box, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her final, golden lifeline abandon her. Harrison looked around the room, expecting his loyal subjects to defend him. But the silence that followed was not just shock. It was the sound of an empire turning to dust. The mass exodus began in total, eerie silence. The wealthy guests did not linger to offer condolences or ask further questions. They simply stood up, picked up their expensive wool coats and designer purses, and headed straight for the heavy wooden doors. They wanted to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the sinking, radioactive ship that was Harrison's life. No one said goodbye. No one offered to help. The grand, opulent birthday celebration dissolved into a rapid, frantic evacuation. Aunt Gemma, the woman who had laughed the loudest at the dirty penny, suddenly broke away from the fleeing crowd. She scurried toward me, her face plastered with a desperate, sickeningly sweet smile. She had just realized that the invisible, worthless niece was now a multi-millionaire holding the deeds to the family's assets. "Sloane, darling," Gemma cooed, reaching out to softly grasp my hand. "We had no idea. We were profoundly manipulated by your father. You must know that, Marshall, and I always supported you in our hearts. We can sit down, discuss Marshall's loan over a nice dinner, and work this out as a family. We are blood, after all." I looked down at her outstretched hand, then up into her desperate, calculating eyes. "Do not touch me, Gemma," I said softly, my voice laced with pure ice. "And do not lie to me. I remember Thanksgiving 6 years ago. I remember you sitting in the living room, laughing with Corinne, saying that Beckett was always too fragile for the real world and that it was a relief he was no longer dragging the family down." Gemma's face instantly drained of blood. She stumbled backward as if she had been burned by a hot iron. "Your debt will be sent to a third-party collection agency on Monday morning." I informed her coldly. "I suggest you start packing your house, too." Gemma turned and fled, disappearing into the crowded hallway, leaving her husband Marshall trailing behind her in a panic. Seeing the last of his loyal subjects abandon him, Harrison finally snapped. The sheer reality of his total public humiliation and financial ruin broke whatever fragile sanity he had left. He let out a feral, inarticulate roar and lunged across the glass table toward me, his hands outstretched, fully intending to physically harm the daughter who had destroyed him. He never even made it past the podium. Warren, the process server, moved with startling speed. He stepped smoothly in front of me, planting his heavy boots firmly on the ground. He shoved a strong, unyielding hand firmly against Harrison's chest, halting his momentum instantly. With his other hand, Warren reached to his heavy leather belt and unclipped a pair of steel handcuffs, letting them dangle visibly in the light of the chandelier. "Take one more step toward my client," Warren warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute obedience, "and I will personally arrest you for attempted assault on a secured creditor." The local police are already stationed in the parking lot to handle the vehicle repossession. "Do you really want to end this night in the back of a squad car, Harrison?" Harrison froze. He stared at the steel cuffs, his chest heaving rapidly, his face a mess of sweat and broken pride. The fight drained out of him entirely. He slumped backward, leaning heavily against the podium for support, a hollow, defeated shell of a man. Then, the final, ultimate betrayal occurred. Fallon, who had been sobbing uncontrollably on the floor clutching the rejected engagement ring, suddenly stood up. Her expensive makeup was severely ruined, running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The golden child, the daughter who had benefited from every single stolen dollar, looked at her parents with pure, unadulterated hatred. "This is all your fault," Fallon screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Corinne and Harrison. "You are both incredibly stupid. You told me we were rich. You told me Reed would marry me and I would be set for life. You ruined my life. You lost everything." Corinne reached out, crying hysterically, tears ruining her own makeup. "Fallon, sweetie, please, do not say that. We did this all for you. We tried to give you the world. Do not touch me," Fallon shrieked, backing away from her mother as if she were diseased. "I have nothing because of you. You are broke. You are pathetic. I hate you." Without another word, Fallon grabbed her expensive coat, turned her back on the parents who had literally sacrificed their own son to fund her lifestyle, and ran out of the banquet hall. She abandoned them the exact second the money dried up. Harrison and Corinne were left standing entirely alone in the center of the massive, empty room. The half-eaten plates of roasted duck, the spilled champagne, and the red-stamped foreclosure documents were the only things remaining of their magnificent empire. I did not offer a parting word. I simply turned around, walked out the doors with Warren, and stepped into the freezing Aspen night, breathing in the crisp, clean air of absolute victory. Fan 11. The eviction. 1402. The American legal system does not operate on emotion. It does not care about the social standing a family once held in their exclusive local country club, and it certainly does not care about the tears of a fallen patriarch. 3 weeks passed since the explosive confrontation in Aspen. During those 21 days, the meticulous, unforgiving machinery of the foreclosure process ground forward with severe, absolute precision. The statutory grace periods expired without a single payment being made, because there was simply no money left to make them. Every single desperate legal extension Harrison's cheap, bargain bin attorneys tried to file with the local courts was swiftly and firmly denied by the judge. They possessed zero liquid capital to back their claims, and their credit score was effectively destroyed. Harrison's frantic attempts to leverage his old networking contacts failed miserably. No one in his elite social circles wanted to lend a single cent to a man whose deeply toxic financial history and horrific family secrets were now a matter of public court record. Thanks to my cousin's live stream, the entire country club knew exactly what he did to Beckett. The grand facade was entirely gone, and their isolation was profound. When the final day of the court-ordered eviction arrived, I did not fly back to the West Coast to watch the execution of the writ of possession. I did not need to stand on the lawn and witness their physical removal. I was sitting comfortably in my East Coast office, drinking hot coffee, while my attorneys provided a sterile, clinical, minute-by-minute report of the morning's events. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a county sheriff pulled up to the long, sweeping driveway of the ancestral estate. The official cruiser parked right in the empty space where the repossessed luxury vehicles used to sit. The armed officers walked up the stone steps and knocked heavily on the grand oak doors, presenting the final, unappealable court-ordered eviction notice. Harrison and Corinne were escorted out of the massive property under the watchful, judging eyes of the wealthy neighborhood they had once tried to fiercely dominate. There was no grand audience this time. There were no relatives to impress, no catering staff to command, and no golden child to proudly shield them. Fallon was long gone, having fled the state entirely, moving in with a distant friend the moment the credit cards started declining and the reality of poverty set in. Harrison and Corinne carried their remaining personal belongings in cheap, recycled cardboard boxes. They loaded them silently into the back of a rusted, rented moving truck. The house was immediately secured. The locks were drilled out and changed by the bank contractors within minutes. The massive property was boarded up, prepped for the upcoming liquidation auction. The empire built on debt and cruelty was officially dismantled, brick by brick. But Harrison, ever the arrogant schemer, tried to execute one final, desperate maneuver. My lead attorney sent me an urgent secure message just as the moving truck was pulling away from the estate. Harrison had apparently kept a secret, hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It was a tiny reserve fund, holding roughly $40,000, meant for absolute emergencies. He marched into a local branch office, demanding they wire the remaining funds to a prepaid debit card so he and Corinne could afford a motel and food for the next few months, while they figured out a plan. He stood at the teller window, sweating, waiting for the lifeline to come through. But it never did. As the primary secured creditor and the court-appointed liquidator of his severely distressed assets, my firm had run a deep forensic sweep of his entire financial footprint 3 days prior. We located the hidden offshore routing number. We filed an emergency injunction with the International Banking Authority, citing severe loan fraud and asset concealment. The teller looked at her screen, frowned, and looked back at Harrison. "I am sorry, sir." The teller informed him coldly, pushing his passport back across the counter. "This account has been permanently frozen by Vanguard Recovery LLC under a federal court order. The current available balance is $0. Harrison collapsed into a plastic chair in the bank lobby, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of strangers. He was utterly, undeniably, and entirely broke. He had $0 to his name. The exact financial system he had ruthlessly used to oppress and control others had become the unforgiving instrument of his own absolute ruin. That afternoon, the winter sun was casting long, golden shadows across my mahogany desk. I was reviewing a new portfolio, enjoying the profound quiet of my East Coast office, when my personal cell phone began to vibrate. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID flashed Corinne's name. I let it ring. I watched the phone shake across the desk until the call went to voicemail. I assumed that was the end of it, but less than 30 seconds later, the screen lit up again. She was relentless. This time, I slowly picked up the phone and answered the call, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the line. "Sloan? Please." Corinne's voice broke immediately. She sounded incredibly small, panicked, and entirely broken. The haughty, elite country club matron was gone, replaced by a terrified, desperate woman standing in the parking lot of a cheap motel. "We are sitting in the moving truck right now." Corinne sobbed, her breath hitching, the sound of traffic blaring in the background. "We have nowhere else to go. Harrison's heart cannot take this stress. Please, Sloan, let us set up a payment plan. Just a few $100s a month. We can work this out over time. You are our daughter. Please do not take the house. It holds all our beautiful family memories. We can be a family again." I sat back in my chair, staring out the massive window at the city's skyline. She was still trying to negotiate a deal. Even after the public humiliation, after the exposure of Beckett's letters, She was still desperately hoping to pull a fragile thread of familial obligation to save her own comfort. She wanted to preserve the house, the walls, the physical structure, completely ignoring the fact that those walls were built on a foundation of severe abuse and tragedy. Beckett needed a family once, too, I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger, sadness, or sympathy. Corinne fell silent on the other end of the line. The truth hit her like a physical blow. He begged for help. I continued softly. And you let him die just to protect a lie. You chose your beautiful memories over your own son. Now you get to live with them in a motel. Before she could form another desperate, weeping word, I tapped the screen and disconnected the call. I immediately opened the contact settings on my phone, hit the block button, and permanently severed the final, toxic tie to my past. There would be no reconciliation. There would be no tearful holiday dinners, no fake apologies, and absolutely no second chances. I set the phone down and reached into my tailored blazer pocket. My fingers brushed against the small, hard object resting at the bottom. I pulled it out and placed it on the cold glass of my desk. It was the dirty penny. The exact coin Harrison had arrogantly thrown at me during the birthday party in Aspen. It was supposed to represent my absolute worthlessness. It was meant to be the ultimate, humiliating insult from a patriarch who firmly believed he owned the world and everyone in it. I stared at the tarnished copper. It looked so incredibly small and insignificant now. I stood up, picked up the coin, and walked over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting in the corner of my office. Next to the shredder was a metal wastebasket. I held the penny over the basket, opened my fingers, and let it fall. The coin hit the bottom of the empty metal bin with a sharp, echoing clink. A hollow sound for a hollow family. I picked up the final copy of Harrison's defaulted promissory note, fed the thick paper into the slot of the shredder, and listened to the steel blades catch. The machine pulled the document down with a sharp, mechanical whir. In less than 3 seconds, the ultimate symbol of Harrison's tyranny was reduced to unrecognizable strips of waste. The ledger was finally, permanently balanced. The destruction of their grand empire was not just a simple financial correction. It was the inevitable, inescapable consequence of their own profound malice. They had spent decades assigning cruel price tags to human lives, eagerly discarding those who did not fit their perfectly curated, superficial narrative. In the end, they were destroyed by the very currency they worshipped. You must never let toxic people determine your value. True worth is built in the deep silence of your own resilience. And karma, when properly directed with patience and strategy, rarely misses an address. Many relatives call me heartless for driving my own parents to the streets penniless. But when justice doesn't exist within a family, you have to create it yourself through the law. Do you think I was wrong for not giving them one last chance? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of deserved retribution, don't forget to like and subscribe to watch more explosive dramas. See you soon.